Do you believe a creature from the forest, once rescued by a human, could return to save that same human's life? Eleanor Hayes survived, not because of modern medicine, but because something extraordinary emerged from the mist. In the icy wilderness of Granite Ridge, Montana, a towering figure with ash-gray fur stood silently beside her broken body, keeping her warm through the night. It didn't growl. It didn't flee. It remembered. The truth few dare to believe is this: a being the Salish people call the Oathkeeper, known to Eleanor simply as Ash, appeared when death was near. And it did more than watch. It acted. Ash carried Eleanor across frozen rivers and snow-covered cliffs to a long-abandoned ranger station, leaving behind her dropped gear and a cedar branch, the symbol of a sacred promise. Eleanor wasn't delusional. She's a 45-year-old veteran ranger who spent her life protecting this land, driven by guilt, solitude, and a debt she thought she could never repay. This story will change how you see nature, not just as trees and soil, but as memory, intention, and maybe even grace. In a real courtroom, with real evidence and sworn confessions, Eleanor's testimony halted a multi-million-dollar deforestation project. A wilderness preserve now bears the name Granite Ridge because of what she saw and who she met. If you skip this story, you'll keep believing nature is silent. But if you stay, you might just discover the forest listens, and it remembers those who keep their promises. The snow had started to rot at the edges, melting into the cracked granite like forgotten promises. It was early spring in Granite Ridge, but winter hadn't quite let go. Eleanor Hayes moved slowly through the thinning white, each step sinking slightly, her breath misting the air in soft, shallow clouds. The old pine trees creaked overhead, their bark dark with snow melt. She paused, fingers brushing the low-hanging branch of a Douglas fir, eyes narrowing at the faint impressions in the slush near a bend in the trail. Larger than any boot she'd known. Wider, deeper, and shaped wrong. She crouched, knees aching beneath her worn wool pants, and pressed a gloved hand beside the print. Her hand vanished inside the shape. It was still fresh, edges sharp, the snow around it only slightly softened. Her heart thudded. Not fear, not quite awe. Something older. It had taken her weeks to get here, tracking rumors through snowdrift and silence. The proof she needed was somewhere in this range. She'd felt it in her bones. The corporate flags tied to tree trunks weeks ago still haunted her dreams. Bright orange plastic screaming that this land was no longer safe. Not from man. Granite Ridge had once been her second skin. She knew every switchback, every elk trail, every patch of wind-scoured moss on every sunless rock. Until the landslide. Until the day the mountains roared and took her husband. Her son. Her whole life. The ground beneath her shifted. A subtle crack. Eleanor stiffened. The cliff. She hadn't seen how close she was. She moved to stand. The ice gave way. There was no time to scream. Only the cracking of brittle frost and a blur of sky spinning. Then nothing but the sharp punch of cold air and pain. She hit hard. Her hip struck first, then her shoulder, then everything blurred in a sickening crunch. Her head smacked something unyielding, and a bolt of white exploded behind her eyes. A crack echoed in her leg. Too sharp, too final to be anything but bone. For a moment, everything stopped. The snow around her was too bright. The trees above seemed too far. She tasted iron. Her backpack had torn loose. The radio was gone. Her leg twisted at an angle that didn't belong to it. Pain pulsed in waves, blinding, hot, alive. Her breath came in short, harsh gasps. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her thigh and felt warmth under the fabric. Blood. A lot of it. She pulled off her glove, reached shakily into her jacket pocket, and pulled out the old handkerchief, frayed, stained. Faint letters embroidered in blue at the corner. Sam, She folded it over the wound, tying it tight, biting down on her own lip until she tasted copper again. Her eyes burned. Not from the wind. "I'm sorry," she whispered. To the wind, to the memory, to the boy who'd asked her to come home early that day. Time blurred. Light shifted. The sky dimmed. Shadows stretched longer across the snow. She drifted in and out, half dreaming, half waiting. Then came the sound. 3 knocks, low, measured, from the tree line above. She blinked, unsure if her mind had begun to fray. But the coyotes had heard it too. Their howls stopped mid-throat, silence rippling outward like a shock wave. The nearest shape, sleek, gray-backed, its eyes reflecting gold, paused just beyond the ring of rocks. Its nose twitched. Then it backed away, one paw retreating soundlessly into the trees. Another knock, like a heartbeat. Something was coming. Not fast, not loud, but the woods shifted with its arrival. A whisper of wind, the hush of branches parting, the faint crunch of weight, not just heavy, but purposeful. Then a figure stepped into view. Massive, still, ash-gray fur, shoulders like a stone wall, arms longer than they should have been. The head, almost human in silhouette, tilted slightly as it looked at her. Eleanor couldn't move, not out of fear, but because everything in her screamed to stay still, to witness. Its eyes were amber, not glowing, not beastly, just watching. The coyotes had vanished. The wind picked up, brushing powdery snow across her cheeks. She was shivering violently now, the handkerchief soaked, blood pooling dark beneath her. The creature stepped forward, slowly. Snow crunched beneath each step. Then, without warning, it sat down, not facing her, back turned. It leaned gently against her broken frame, its warmth immediate, vast, like lying beside a furnace. Eleanor wanted to scream, to flee, but something about the weight at her back, the rhythm of its breath, the silence between them, stopped her. The wind had died. The forest listened. Her eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion and pain. Her fingers gripped a clump of snow. She opened her mouth, the words soft as smoke. "Ash, is that you?" She didn't know why she said it, only that it felt true. Felt like something she'd once lost and thought would never return. There was no reply, only the deep thump of a heartbeat beneath thick fur. Not fast, not wild, just steady. It felt like earth itself. Her breathing slowed. Her head tilted gently to the side, pressing into the curve of its shoulder. Before she slipped into sleep, she felt movement. The creature, Ash, reached beside them. A broken pine branch, its needles stiff and sharp with frost, scraped against the snow. It pulled the branch around them, shielding the wind's bite from her exposed side. Eleanor smiled. And then darkness took her. But it wasn't the darkness of death. It was the kind that wraps around you when you know you're no longer alone. Something ancient had come to her. Not to conquer, not to claim, but to remember. And in that remembering, stay. The cold still hadn't lifted when Eleanor's eyes cracked open again. Her breath came in shallow bursts, white clouds curling from her lips into the icy morning. Pain was the first thing she felt. Raw, pulsing through her thigh and shoulder, anchored in her ribs like a dull knife left behind. But something was different. The weight against her back wasn't snow, it wasn't stone, it was warm, and it breathed, slow, deep. She didn't move at first, only listened. The rhythm of it, a steady thud like a drum buried deep in the earth. It wasn't a dream. Her fingers brushed thick strands of fur, coarse and cold at the tips but warm underneath, like the underbelly of an animal that had been out in the frost too long. She remembered falling. The blood. The coyotes. Then the knocks. 3 of them, low, solid, like someone tapping on the ribs of the forest itself. She tried to lift her head but couldn't. Everything inside her rebelled. Her legs screamed. Her mouth was dry and cracked. Still, she turned her gaze just enough to see a sliver of movement beside her. It wasn't gone. The creature, Ash, her mind had called it, remained, seated against her back, facing the trees as if guarding them both. Steam rose gently from its shoulders, drifting up toward the skeletal branches. Its head tilted slightly at some sound only it could hear. It didn't flinch. It didn't snarl. It simply was. She didn't understand why it stayed, why it hadn't dragged her off, or left her behind like roadkill. Instead, it had sat through the night, keeping her warm. The thought made her throat tighten. Her body trembled against the cold, a ripple that made her whimper. Just once. The sound was small, broken, but Ash heard it. Without turning, it reached behind with one enormous arm and nudged her slightly, carefully. Its hand, long-fingered and dark with silver ash fur, slid around her shoulder and rested gently across her chest. Not tight, just enough to hold her in place, to tell her she wasn't alone. She froze. Every instinct shouted to pull away, but there was no fear in its touch, no pressure, just presence. A silent, solid presence that settled over her like a blanket she didn't ask for but suddenly needed. Her heart pounded fast, unsure whether it was panic or gratitude. Maybe both. The coyotes were gone. The wind was still. For a moment, she wanted to speak, but her throat cracked when she tried, like old paper tearing. So she whispered, barely louder than the air between them. "Why?" She didn't expect an answer. Ash didn't move. But something about the silence shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, as though the question had been received, even if no words came back. She tilted her head slightly. The fur against her cheek smelled like pine smoke and river stone. Not foul, not animal in the way she expected, just wild and ancient. The pressure in her chest eased. Something loosened where grief had long since hardened. And then her lips moved again, this time without thought. "Ash, is it you?" She didn't know what she meant. Only that the name had fallen from her before. Ash still didn't speak, but its breathing shifted, just enough to feel like acknowledgement. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, or memory, or both. She whispered into the wind, her voice fraying. "I'm so sorry." The creature didn't respond, but it didn't leave. Instead, it leaned back just enough that its shoulder pressed more firmly to hers. A quiet gesture that didn't ask for understanding, only presence. She listened to its heartbeat again, deep, ancient, steady like the thrum of earth under snow. That sound became her lullaby. Sleep took her again, not from weakness this time, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Later, she stirred when light crept through the branches, thin and golden. Her lashes fluttered open to a different posture beside her. Ash was still there, but sitting up straighter now, watchful. She blinked against the morning haze. Her leg throbbed beneath the tourniquet of the blood-soaked handkerchief. Her fingers reached instinctively to check it, but she stopped when Ash turned its head slightly, not facing her, just watching, as if asking silently whether she could move. Her lips curled, just barely. A cracked, dry smile. Ash didn't move closer. But then, with a fluid, strange grace, it reached to the side, picked up a branch, thick with brittle pine needles, and dragged it across the snow, setting it as a windbreak to her left. She blinked again. He knew. It wasn't random. He had seen she was exposed, and responded. Tears welled suddenly, hot against her freezing face. Not from fear. From something else entirely. The last time someone had cared enough to shield her from the wind, it had been Sam. In a blizzard. On the edge of a frozen lake, long before everything collapsed. And now this creature, this presence. It didn't ask questions. It didn't want thanks. It simply gave what it had. The silence between them grew full again. Not empty, not threatening. She whispered to it, voice ragged, lost in memory. "I lost them. The mountain took everything." Her eyes drifted shut again. The snow settled lightly on her coat. The pain dulled but didn't fade. She felt Ash shift beside her one last time. A slow motion, a quiet exhale, And then stillness again. They stayed like that through the morning. No one moved, not even the trees. Just a woman broken by grief and a myth older than fire, sharing breath beneath the ancient canopy, as if the forest had made space just for them. And somewhere, in the hollows between her ribs where guilt once lived, something new began to breathe again. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. When she closed her eyes once more, Eleanor was no longer waiting to die. She was listening to the heartbeat beside her, to the silence that no longer felt empty, and to the soft groan of the trees, whispering that this story wasn't over yet, not even close. The sound of wood dragging across packed snow was the first thing she noticed when the world swam back into focus. It wasn't loud, just steady, rhythmic. Eleanor blinked slowly, light cracking through the corners of her lashes like frost melting on glass. Her body ached in layers, deep bruises under older pain, every breath catching in her ribs. The cold was still there, but it no longer bit. Instead, she felt wrapped in something softer, wool, familiar. She turned her head slightly and saw the edge of an old plaid blanket, her blanket, tucked up under her chin, the stitching frayed in the corner where Sam used to chew at it as a boy when he was nervous. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten here. Then she felt it. Movement beneath her, a low pull, the vibration of snow shifting under wood. She was lying on her old ranger's sled, the one she'd abandoned near her service cabin last year when her knees gave out. It had no straps now, no rope handles. But someone, or something, was pulling it with absolute care. Through the slit in the blanket, she caught a glimpse of broad shoulders ahead, fur like ash, long arms that moved like tree limbs in a strong wind, deliberate but quiet. Ash. Still here, still moving, still guiding. The forest around them was hushed, but not dead. A few birds called from the high branches, their voices thin in the early spring chill. Icicles wept slowly from the eaves of rock outcrops. They moved through narrow game paths and frozen creek beds, snow crunching softly underfoot. She watched how he stepped, always mindful, always choosing the flattest surface, avoiding sharp rocks and buried brambles. Even in deep snow, he kept the sled level, dragging it across the white with a grace that didn't belong to anything so large. She wanted to speak, to ask where he was taking her, but her voice failed. It wasn't needed. There was something calming in the silence, in the way he moved, as if her body already knew this rhythm, as if somewhere far below the grief and the pain, her bones remembered it. Hours passed, maybe more. The sun shifted through the trees, golden at times, then dulled by mist. Her wounds throbbed. Her leg burned where the tourniquet had loosened. Blood seeped slowly again, warm against her chilled skin. She winced and whispered, "It's starting again." The words weren't meant for him. But he stopped. No sound, just stillness. Ash turned his head, only slightly, then lowered to one knee beside her. His large hand moved toward her chest, not to hurt, but to place something against it. A stone, smooth, round, cold. Eleanor blinked at it. Dark gray, almost black, with a white ring around the edge. A river stone, carefully chosen, set gently just above her heart. She felt its weight settle like a memory. It took her a moment, but she understood. She'd seen this done before, not by him, but by the elders of the Salish. A sign of passage, of mourning, of peace. He thought she was dying. The air felt thinner then. Her breath caught. She closed her eyes and murmured, "I don't deserve that." But the stone remained. He stood slowly, gripping the sled's rope again. Snow cracked softly under his step as they moved forward once more. The terrain grew steeper. The path wound tighter. The trees closed in on both sides, brushing the sled's edges. A frozen creek spread ahead, the ice buckling in places, water trickling just beneath its skin. He paused, testing the surface with one foot, then crossed. The sled dragged behind, her weight dipping into the weak spots, ice groaning like distant thunder. One crack snapped too loud. Water spat upward. She gasped, but Ash kept moving. He didn't rush. He didn't slow. He simply went forward. Once across, he turned back to glance at the sled. At her. His eyes were steady, watching. And then he kept walking. She shivered harder. The cold had crept back in. Her fingers went numb. Her thoughts blurred again. Sam's voice echoed in her ears. Not real, but real enough. Asking if she'd come home early that day. If she'd keep her promise. I tried, she whispered, lips cracked, barely moving. I just needed more time. Ash didn't turn, but his pace slowed. The snow was deeper now. Up to his knees. He pushed through it with effort. Even a creature like him had limits. But he never hesitated. Branches scraped against her shoulders. A pine cone dropped and rolled near her feet. Her vision dimmed again. Not unconsciousness, just drift. A dream creeping at the edges. She saw her boy in that dream, laughing near the ranger station, holding a pine staff he'd carved himself, saying her name through the trees like he used to when chasing deer tracks. She tried to answer, tried to say his name back, but the words never came. Then something jolted her awake. A sudden change in air pressure. The scent of old wood, charcoal, oil. A door. Ash had stopped. Before them stood the faded front wall of the old ranger's cabin, half covered in moss. Its chimney collapsed, but its door still intact. She hadn't seen this place in years. Thought it had fallen for good. Ash reached forward and pressed the door gently. It creaked open on rusted hinges. The inside was dim. Dust hung in frozen beams of light. Cobwebs sagged in corners, but it was dry. Still standing, still holding, he pulled the sled closer, right up to the threshold. Then, without sound, he bent down, lifted her, not rough, not clumsy, and carried her inside. Her head rested against his shoulder. The heart beat again, steady, familiar. He laid her down on a pile of old canvas bags and placed the blanket around her again, folding it at the edges like someone who had watched humans do this before. His hand brushed the stone on her chest, then withdrew. She tried to lift her head, to look at him, to ask something, anything. But when she blinked, he was gone. No sound of footsteps, no creak of the door, just the faint smell of pine, the quiet echo of breath, the distant drip of water from the melting snow outside. She was alone again, but not abandoned. She knew the difference now. Ash had brought her back, not to leave her, but to give her a chance. And somewhere out there she knew he was watching. Not to be seen, not to be thanked, just to make sure she lived long enough to tell the story. And for the first time in years, Eleanor wanted to. Not because it would save her, but because it might save something else. The land, the wild, the truth. The wind whistled low through the cracks in the window frame, but inside it was warm. Or warm enough. She curled tighter under the blanket and reached up to touch the stone on her chest. Her fingers trembled, not from fear anymore, but from something closer to reverence. Then she closed her eyes, and the sound of dragging wood faded into memory. But the trail it left behind, cut deep into the snow, across creek beds and forgotten clearings, would remain long after the storm passed, long after the world started spinning again. And somewhere, just beyond the tree line, a heartbeat still echoed through the forest, waiting, listening. The scent of old wood and time hung thick in the air, like memory made solid. Eleanor stirred beneath the blanket, its edges heavy with frost melt, her breath slow but present. The ranger cabin hadn't changed much since she last crossed its threshold. Years ago, when the roof still held through spring storms and the stove hadn't rusted shut. Now everything was softened by moss, aged by silence, but still standing, still keeping watch. Light filtered through the crooked slats in the shutters, thin and silver, casting soft shadows across the floor. Dust floated in slow spirals, stirred only by the faint heat of her breath. For a while, she stayed still, unsure if movement would undo everything. Her body ached with a deeper kind of pain now. Not just injury, but reckoning. She reached for her leg, fingers numb but aware. The bleeding had slowed. Her makeshift bandage had held somehow. And then she saw it, just beyond her hip, carefully set within reach. Her old canvas field pack. She froze. It was impossible. She had lost it during the fall. She remembered the tearing sound, the way it had slipped down into the dark while she clung to the ledge before the cliff gave out entirely. But there it was. Zipper still half open, damp around the edges, but intact. Inside, she saw familiar outlines. Her small leather-bound journal, the photo tucked inside its cover, the roll of gauze she'd saved for emergencies, the scarf Sam had knitted her before the accident. All of it, gathered, returned, placed. Her throat caught. Not from pain this time, but from something quieter. She touched the journal, thumbing its warped spine, and when her fingers brushed the photo inside, she couldn't help it. Her breath hitched. There he was. Sam, smiling in front of the service cabin, wind in his hair, a pine cone in one hand, and beside him, just barely visible, her late husband's shadow, half cropped by the frame. She swallowed hard, tracing the edge of the image when another shape caught her eye near the doorway. Not a threat, not a presence, just something placed there, gently, deliberately. A small branch of cedar, fresh, bright green despite the lingering cold. The ends were snapped clean, not chewed or weathered. Arranged carefully on a flat stone, just beneath the coat hook. Eleanor stared. She'd spent years working with the Salish guides along these ridges. She remembered the stories they shared on cold nights, the rites, the meanings. Cedar wasn't just a plant. It was a prayer, a shield, a message. She sat up slowly, ignoring the pull in her side. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the branch. It was still damp, as if it had only been cut hours ago, as if it had been placed just before she woke. Ash had come back, again, quietly. She looked toward the door, but it remained ajar, untouched. No sound from outside, no sign of departure. Only the slow breath of wind against the broken chimney, the low creak of the beams shifting under the weight of time. Her heart beat loud in her ears, not in fear, but in awe, he remembered. She closed her eyes, the cedar pressed against her chest, and let the silence settle. Later, when the fire finally caught in the old stove, kindled with the flint from her pack and a few stubborn pages torn from her trail guide, the warmth spread slow but steady. She crouched beside it, knees shaking, breath shallow, and placed the branch on the hearth's edge. A silent offering. A thank you she couldn't speak aloud. That night, sleep came in pieces. She drifted in and out, dreamed of rivers she hadn't walked in decades, voices long buried, faces she hadn't allowed herself to recall. Sometimes, in the half-sleep, she thought she heard breathing just outside the cabin, slow, steady, familiar. But when she looked, the window revealed only trees. And yet she knew he was there, not intruding, not demanding, just watching, protecting. The second time she woke, just past midnight, moonlight flooded the small square window above her bedroll. It painted the room in soft whites and pale shadows. And there, just beyond the glass, she saw a figure, seated on a rock beneath the trees. Still, massive, not hiding, not seeking, just being. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. And in that moment, something shifted again. She didn't feel alone. The ache inside her, old, deep, wrapped around the roots of every loss, felt less like an open wound and more like a scar beginning to soften. The next morning brought a clearer sky. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long beams across the floor. She sat up slowly, muscles sore but calmer. The fire had gone out sometime before dawn. Frost edged the inside of the windows again, but something else caught her eye. Near the stove, placed just beside her boots, was another gift. Small, simple, A ring of twine made from woven grass and bark, bound around a sprig of cedar and a single silver-gray hair. Long, coarse, caught in the twist like a signature. She picked it up gently. No words could have held the meaning that gesture carried. He had left a part of himself behind, not as proof, but as presence, as trust, as memory. She stared at the loop in her hands, the cedar still fragrant, the hair catching sunlight like a thread of moonlight. Then she whispered, "You remember me too." The forest outside didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Not anymore. Ash didn't stay to be seen. He had nothing to prove, nothing to demand. He was the kind of guardian that left no footprints you could follow, but always returned to the places that mattered. And now, somehow, she mattered. She pulled her coat around her shoulders, tied the loop of cedar around her wrist like a bracelet, and stepped toward the door. The snow had crusted over, brittle and bright. Birdsong echoed through the trees, timid but returning. She stood there for a long while, looking, listening. No movement, no shadow. But she raised her hand anyway, a quiet wave, a silent thank you, and somewhere, she believed, he saw it. Not with eyes, but with something deeper. Whatever thread had tied them, through pain, through memory, through this strange miracle of survival, was still taut, still holding. And in the hush of that morning, Eleanor knew this cabin was no longer just a place to survive. It had become a place to return to begin again. And the forest had allowed it, not with fanfare, but with presence. And that was enough. It started with a sound Eleanor hadn't heard in days, boots crunching on snow. Sharp, fast-paced, human. The kind of footfall that didn't belong to anything wild. She sat up slowly from the cot she'd built in the corner of the cabin, her ribs still sore. The stone Ash had left for her tucked under her pillow like a child's totem. The fire had long gone cold, just faint gray embers whispering in the stove. Her breath turned silver in the morning air. She reached for her jacket, slipped on her gloves with stiff fingers, and limped toward the window. The forest outside was blanketed in silence, but closer, at the bend of the trail where the old growth thinned, movement stirred. A man in a red parka pushed through the brush, his walkie clipped to his shoulder, scanning left and right with the sharp eyes of someone trained to expect the worst. Behind him, 2 others followed, one of them carrying a med kit, the other with a camera around his neck. Rescue. Eleanor didn't open the door right away. She simply stood there, fingers pressed against the wooden frame, watching as the 3 figures moved closer, then froze when they saw the smoke trail curling from her chimney. One called her name. She answered only when they reached the steps. Her voice cracked. "Took you long enough." The man closest to her exhaled deeply, something between relief and disbelief. "Jesus, Hayes, you're alive!" "Barely." Inside, she let them check her leg. She didn't mention the creature. Not at first. Let them do their jobs. Stabilize the injury, check her vitals, take photos of the location. The woman with the camera was young, quiet, clearly not from around here. She looked at the cedar branch on the stone with a furrowed brow, then noticed the twine bracelet on Eleanor's wrist. Said nothing. Only after they'd radioed in and confirmed she was safe. Only then did Eleanor speak. "What's the furthest your boot ever sank in fresh snow?" she asked suddenly, voice distant. The medic looked up from wrapping her leg. "Maybe a foot." "Depends." Eleanor gestured out the door. "There's a trail, about 3 miles back. Follow it with your eyes, not your feet. You'll see prints, but they're not ours." They didn't laugh. Not right away. The trees made that hard. She leaned forward slightly. "You'll find fur, too. In the bramble under the ridge. Gray, long, like smoke." The woman with the camera stepped out and didn't come back in for a long while. By the time the team helped Eleanor into the snowmobile sled, the sky had clouded over. Wind shifted in sharp bursts. Snow began to fall again. Not heavy, just enough to cover what had been left behind, but not fast enough. Because later, after the chopper came and she was airlifted to the small hospital in Missoula, after the scans and saline and statements, the evidence trickled in. Photos. Boots beside a set of tracks almost twice the width. No tread, No toe marks like a bear, just deep, oval indentations in the crust, spread in a line like a biped. Each print spaced wider than a man's full stride. Clumps of fur, tangled in pine bark and brambles. Coarse, gray, flecked with silver. And then the photo they hadn't meant to capture. A single frame from the woman's roll, shot from the tree line facing the ridge. She'd been trying to get a wide landscape, document the terrain. But in the shadows, between two cedar trunks, a shape stood out. Massive, upright, shoulders hunched forward, head turned slightly. One arm reaching toward the sled where Eleanor had been. The photo was grainy, but it was real. When the image was processed and printed, she held it in her lap and said nothing for a long time. Just traced the outline of the figure with her fingertip. The hospital walls were beige, quiet, safe, but sterile. She missed the sound of the stove crackling, the forest breathing, the silence that felt alive, not empty. They gave her the evidence in a manila envelope, said she could do what she wanted with it. Some suggested submitting it to the agency, others said nothing at all. Then came the reporters, the podcasts, the cryptid blogs. One of the rescue workers had leaked the photo. It spread, not viral, but deep, into the veins of the internet where believers lived, where people had waited decades for something like this. And the reactions split the room. Skeptics called it a hoax, pixel blur, a trick of light. Others, those who'd grown up on the edge of the wild, recognized the posture, the silence in it, the restraint. The Salish elders came to see her. Not all of them. Just two. Quiet men with long memories and slow speech. One looked at the photo and placed a hand on her shoulder. "He saved you," he said. She nodded. They didn't ask for proof, because they already knew. Weeks passed. Her leg healed slowly. The scar it left behind was thick and jagged, a line drawn straight down to the truth. Her niece Clara came from Seattle, hair still tied back from the courtroom. She listened to the story, all of it, without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Clara opened the folder, studied the photo, then said, "So what now?" Eleanor leaned back in the stiff hospital chair, eyes fixed on the window. "Now," she said, "we protect what's left." Outside, the snow began to fall again, not heavy, just enough to whisper over the trees. And somewhere out there, in the woods that had once swallowed her whole, something walked with careful steps. Not gone, not waiting to be found, just watching, still keeping the silence between heartbeats, still remembering, still here. The courthouse in Missoula looked like it hadn't changed since the 50s. Concrete shoulders, dusty windows, an American flag tugging sideways in the Montana wind. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper, old wood, and cold coffee. Eleanor sat in the front row with her hands folded tightly in her lap, wrists stiff from weeks of healing. The bracelet of cedar twine still tied snug above her pulse. Clara sat beside her, crisp suit, hair knotted back like a coiled line, ready to pull taut. The room wasn't crowded, but it was charged. Local press had taken the back rows. Two from the Forest Service filled the bench near the wall, and a thin man with a tie too tight scribbled furiously into a yellow notepad. And across from them, behind a table of lawyers in black wool, sat Alan Stout, the name behind the company now trying to split Granite Ridge in half for logging rights. His smile was polite, practiced, empty, like someone shaking hands before swinging an axe. The judge arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a face that had seen too many years of land fights and not enough days in the mountains. He asked for quiet. Everyone obeyed. Clara stood first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pace. Just let the weight of each sentence drop like water into a still lake. She talked about the land, the species marked endangered that called it home, the legal precedent under the Endangered Species Act. She showed maps of migration routes, erosion models, wildfire risks from deforestation. Then she placed the photo on the overhead projector, the one from the edge of the ridge. The silhouette between trees. Gasps were stifled. Murmurs followed. Clara didn't call it Bigfoot. She called it an undocumented species, large, bipedal, clearly intelligent in its behavior. She said it had saved a woman's life. The room was silent for a full breath after. Then came the other side. Stout's team countered with satellite photos, plans of tree removal zones, job creation estimates. They cast doubt on the photo's authenticity, called it folklore, anecdote, called Eleanor's injuries unfortunate but unrelated. Said no court in the country could pause a development on the basis of campfire stories and blurry film. Eleanor stood when the judge asked if she wished to make a statement. Her body still hurt in the cold. She moved slow, eyes steady. She didn't speak from notes. She told them how it felt to lie on that cliff, bleeding into the snow, the sky folding in. She told them about the warmth on her back that came without teeth. She described the sound of 3 slow knocks on the trees, the same pattern she'd heard decades ago on trail nights with Salish trackers who warned never to ignore it. She told them she survived, not because someone found her, but because something did. Then she placed the cedar branch on the table in front of her. "This doesn't grow near where I fell," she said. "And yet it was waiting in the cabin before I woke." She didn't need to cry. She didn't need to plead. The silence in the room was proof enough something sacred had been touched. Later, a tribal elder took the stand. His hair was long, braided down the back. His voice came slow and dry like wind passing through a dry gorge. He didn't call it Bigfoot either. He called it the one who watches. Said the creature wasn't part of them, but walked alongside. Said it had always lived in the folds of the world people stopped listening to. He looked straight at the judge and said, "This forest remembers her. She almost died in it, but the land chose not to let her go. You should listen." Then came the tape. Clara had warned Eleanor it would be risky, hard to get in as evidence. But it made it. A leaked recording from a shareholder meeting Stout had held in private last year. The voice was unmistakably his. "I don't care what the locals think they saw. Let them believe it's some mountain ghost. We don't need the press asking what's out there until the contracts are signed. Then they can have their myths." The room snapped quiet. Even the scribbler with the yellow pad stopped writing. The judge leaned forward, brow drawn tight. That was the crack, the shift. Not enough to name the creature, but enough to name the lie. In the end, the ruling came not with thunder, but with breath. The project was halted. Granite Ridge would remain protected under emergency conservation status, pending ecological review, and Eleanor was granted temporary stewardship over her old ranger territory. Not as a ranger, but as someone who belonged there again. Outside, after it ended, the cold returned in gusts. People offered congratulations, cameras flashed, hands were shaken. But Eleanor didn't smile until they reached the edge of town and stood by the truck, and Clara, still holding the case file, turned and said softly, "You did it." Eleanor shook her head. "He did it." That night she slept in her own bed, the cedar bracelet still tied, her backpack packed again for spring. Not to prove anything, not anymore, but to return, because the land had spoken, not in words, not in judgment, but in witness. And she knew, deep in her bones, that someone out there had heard too, far beyond the courthouse, beyond the law, in the still woods, under the endless canopy. Something watched, something remembered, and when she was ready to go back, the forest would open. Not all the way, but just enough, for those who had learned how to listen. Evening came slower in the spring. The sky over Granite Ridge turned a warm gold before surrendering to blue, then faded into that quiet, steel gray that held the stars just out of reach. The trees moved only when they meant to, and in the cabin at the edge of the trail Eleanor once called hers, a soft fire hummed inside the old stove like it remembered her touch. The place had changed since that first return. Not by much, but enough to carry the feeling of someone who belonged. The moss hadn't been scraped off the roof. The shutter still hung crooked on the east window. But there was warmth now. The kind that lingered after footsteps had long vanished. A folded blanket in the corner. A worn mug left out from tea made hours ago. The smell of cedar smoke braided with silence. Eleanor sat outside, her boots resting on a flat stone still damp from the last snowmelt. She wore her old ranger coat, the sleeves looser than she remembered, the zipper still catching halfway up. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose twist, and the cedar bracelet stayed on her wrist like it had grown there. She held nothing in her hands, not even a cup. She didn't need to. She was listening. The wind moved through the trees in slow pulses, the kind that whispered without words. The kind the old people said carried messages only the heart could translate. Then, without surprise, he came. No rustle, no crack of branch. Just there, between the fog and the shadows, a form took shape like breath condensing in air. Ash stepped from the tree line with the same gravity she remembered. Tall, broad. The same fur the color of stone and fire ash, catching the last light like steel wool in the dusk. He didn't move toward her quickly. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space long before his body crossed it. Eleanor didn't stand. She just raised her hand, and across the distance, Ash did the same. Not a wave, not a signal, just a recognition, like opening a door between two souls that had never fully closed. She smiled. It wasn't a wide smile, just the kind that settled in the corners of your mouth when you see something that reminds you you're not lost. He came closer then, slow steps, no threat in them, no weight heavier than the wind. He sat on the log beside her, the one she'd dragged up from the edge of the creek last week. She hadn't meant it to be for company, but it always had been. They sat that way for a long time, shoulder to shoulder, but not touching, breathing in the same rhythm, a quiet rhythm. She didn't talk at first, just closed her eyes and let her thoughts untangle themselves in the presence of something that didn't demand translation. And then, without turning, she spoke. "They think I made it up, you know." Ash didn't move. "But I don't mind. Some things aren't for explaining. Some things just are." The fire cracked inside the cabin behind them. A crow called somewhere deeper in the ridge. She reached slowly into her coat pocket and pulled out the old scarf. Sam's. Frayed at the ends. A few drops of dried blood still clung to one corner. The faded blue embroidery, almost invisible now. She didn't hand it to him, just laid it on the stone between them. Ash looked down at it, then looked at her. Not with confusion, but with something else. Something like understanding, like memory. He didn't take the scarf. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. It was enormous, his hand, and it moved so gently it barely shifted her coat. But she felt it, not just on her skin, but under it, in her chest, in the space grief used to live. It wasn't comfort. It was connection, and it held no pity, only presence, only acknowledgement. She closed her eyes. The pain in her legs still flared sometimes, but it didn't matter tonight. The cold sat on her joints, but it was a familiar cold. The kind that told you you were alive. The kind that asked you to notice the heat when it came. She whispered barely, "You came back." Ash didn't reply, but his hand stayed, long enough to say everything that words couldn't hold. Then slowly he stood. He didn't rush, didn't vanish. He just moved toward the trees, his back to her, like he trusted her to keep watching. She did. He stopped at the edge of the woods, paused, then lifted his arm. 3 knocks. Slow, even. One hand against a birch trunk, rhythm steady. The same sound from that night on the cliff. The same pattern that told the forest something sacred was passing through. Eleanor stood, not because she wanted him to stay, but because she needed him to know she heard it. She walked to the edge of the porch. Her knees wobbled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Thank you." Ash turned his head slightly, not to look at her, just enough for the moonlight to catch the amber of his eye. Then he disappeared into the trees, not like a ghost, like a guardian returning home. She stayed outside until the fire inside the cabin died down, until the stars came out like freckles on the sky, until the crows settled and the crickets took over. And then, with the wind soft around her, she stepped inside. She didn't take the scarf back from the stone. She left it there. Some things belonged to the silence now. Some things needed to be found again later, by someone else, by him, by time. She closed the cabin door gently, lit a single candle, pulled her chair closer to the window, and wrote one line in her journal. He is not a myth. Then, beneath it, a second. He is a memory that walks. And just before the flame flickered out, she swore she heard the knock again. 1, 2, 3, far off, but close enough to reach her, like a lullaby carved into wood. The cabin smelled like cedar and ink. Morning sunlight sifted through the slats of the shutters, drawing golden lines across the hardwood floor and the pages of Eleanor's journal, now cracked open near the edge of the desk. Her handwriting had changed over the years, slower now, less rigid, more breath than shape, but the words still carried weight. Across from her, Clara sat with a mug of tea cupped in her hands, elbows resting on the table. Her business clothes were gone, traded for a flannel and jeans. Her hair hung loose past her shoulders. She looked older here, and softer, the kind of older that came not from stress, but from returning to something real. Eleanor paused before reading, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the forest leaned in close to the cabin, branches heavy with spring moisture, moss growing thick in the crooks of trees. The quiet was familiar now, not unsettling. It was the kind of quiet that knew you by name. She cleared her throat gently. I don't know if it'll ever get published, she said. But the words needed to live somewhere. Clara nodded, smiling gently. Then let them live. Eleanor looked down at the final page. The title scrawled across the top wasn't dramatic, just honest. Whispers of Ash. She read, Some beings don't speak like us, but they remember. They wait. For those who listen. Her voice faltered at the last word. Not because she forgot it, but because her chest caught on something. A small breath that didn't want to be released just yet. Clara reached over and placed her hand on Eleanor's. The page stayed open. The fire burned low in the stove. The kindling had almost given out, but the warmth lingered anyway. And in that stillness, a sound broke the air. Not sharp, not urgent, just soft. The faintest creak of the front step. They both turned, but no one was there. Clara stood first and crossed to the door, opened it slowly. The smell of pine and damp earth swept in with the light. Then she saw it. A ring of braided cedar sat on the top stair, bound tightly with a few strands of silver-gray hair and threaded with small purple flowers. Wild violets. The kind that only bloomed in early spring, tucked low beneath the trees. There were no footprints, no drag marks, just the gift. Clara turned to look at her aunt, wide-eyed but not startled. Eleanor didn't speak. She walked slowly to the door, one hand on the frame, and knelt despite the protest in her knees. She lifted the ring carefully, holding it like something sacred, because it was, not a trophy. Not a token. A memory, pressed into shape. Her voice came low. He still walks. Clara didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Some truths didn't require retelling. On the stone beside the porch railing, another offering waited. A small piece of wood, hand-carved, rough and uneven. Edges chipped as though made with thick fingers and intention rather than tools. On it, 2 figures sat side by side. One tall, hunched slightly, the other smaller, straight-backed, both looking out toward a mountain ridge, shoulder to shoulder. The carving wasn't perfect, but the message was. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she picked it up. She didn't cry. Not then. She only smiled, the kind of smile that comes from being seen fully, without having to say a word. That night she sat by the hearth and placed the carving on the mantel. She didn't light the fire. Just let the quiet hold her. Before bed, she walked to the door and looked into the woods. No movement, but she lifted her hand anyway. 3 slow knocks against the frame. She waited. The wind rustled lightly through the pines. A low chime from the corner of the porch rang once, just once, and stopped. No gust followed. No echo. She closed her eyes. The silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that listens back. She stepped inside. But before closing the door, she whispered toward the trees. You kept your promise. The moon rose behind the ridge that night, full and pale, casting a silver thread across the snow-melt pools still gathered in the hollows. Somewhere deeper in the forest, between root and mist, a figure watched without stepping forward. He didn't need to come closer. He only needed to know she remembered. And she did. The journal stayed open on the desk. A few blank pages remained. Not many, but enough for more. More words. More listening. More nights when memory returned not as pain, but as presence. Eleanor didn't write that night. Not because there wasn't more to say, but because the air itself had said enough. In the early hours, just before dawn, a crow cawed twice outside the window. A sound answered from far off. Low, throaty, 3 knocks, somewhere just beyond the trees. And then, birdsong, like a story moving on, but never ending. Sometimes, the most extraordinary things in life don't arrive with noise or proof. They come quietly, through a gesture, a presence, a moment that feels like the world holding its breath. There are stories that don't need headlines or explanations, only a place to be felt. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it's more than enough. Because in the end, this isn't just a tale about what can or can't be proven. It's about what we choose to carry forward, what we choose to protect, and what we find when we stop trying to explain the unexplainable. And instead, listen. There are places in this world that hum with memory, where the line between myth and truth isn't a boundary, but a bridge, where silence speaks louder than language, where the forest keeps watch and the wind remembers. And sometimes, healing doesn't come in the form of answers. It comes in presence, in stillness, in the quiet company of something that doesn't ask you to be more than you are, just asks you to be. There is a kind of grace in the unseen, a kind of mercy in knowing that not all things have to be understood to be real. That wonder, when held with reverence, becomes a kind of love, a remembering, a return. So, wherever you are right now, whether in the city lights or beneath the hush of trees, may you leave a little space in your heart for what cannot be named. May you find comfort in what simply is. And may you never stop listening for the quiet knock at the edge of your world. Thank you for staying with this story, for feeling it all the way through. If this touched something in you, left you thinking, wondering, or remembering, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what this story stirred in you. And if you'd like to walk with us again through more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and hit that notification bell. Because sometimes, the ones who listen are the ones who find what others have forgotten.